I saw what Frederick Douglass called these two Christianities in this country. They're really side by side, what he calls the auction block and the church bell. We're connected.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward.
For inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to tell you why we skipped out last week. And then also, we get to sit down with a Christian icon. Jim Wallis sits down with us to talk about his new book, The False White Gospel, Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy. It is an episode that you're not going to want to miss because, trust me, Jim hits a home run. Stay tuned. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm well, and you?
I'm well.
Good.
Missed you last week. Where were you? I showed up to record. You were MIA.
Well, so you ask. I was on a super secret project.
Oh, you were. Oh, are you going to go like all fancy now and be like on assignment?
Yes, I was on assignment.
You were on assignment? Okay, cool. Well, thanks for letting me know. I was here.
Well, I know you probably, well, I'm sure you'd have had a great podcast with all those voices in your head. That would have been entertaining.
Yes.
That could be we should do a whole spoof podcast on that.
No, we shouldn't.
Missy and her friends.
That's not a good idea. So anyways, We're rolling in here on really 2 hours of sleep.
Yes.
Because I'm sure the listeners could care less about another travel nightmare story of ours. But we did get home at 4 o'clock this morning.
We
had
did.
to be up at 7 o'clock this morning to start recording and working and all of these things. And I want to tell you, we won't go into the whole saga of what happened, but I have drawn a conclusion from our experience over the last couple of weeks.
Okay, can't wait to hear.
So 2 weeks ago, we were, traveling, and there were unfortunately devastating storms in our area. Mm-hmm. We literally sat at a restaurant and watched the weather and watched our security cameras to see if a tornado was hitting our house. Yeah. And unfortunately, some devastating tornadoes did hit, not in our area. And then there was another round a few days ago. Mm-hmm. And then yesterday, part of our delays were because of a bad storm that went through part of the Southeast. But I wanted to say this, and I don't want to make light of the devastation that has happened with these storms because it is incredibly tragic. Yeah. But I think I figured out a way to convert the climate change deniers.
Oh, okay. Please do share.
Can we convince the folks who are traveling, who are waiting in a line of 500 people to talk to the customer service, that part of the reason we are seeing these horrific travel delays is because of climate change? Because these storms that are coming through are stronger, they are more intense, they are more damaging. Therefore, this is part of the reason why you're sitting in an airport for 8 hours.
Yeah.
I'm thinking we might convert some folks.
I think it's a good plug for the airlines. I mean, they could make it part of their mission. Want shorter lines? Cut your carbon footprint.
Well, I mean that's kind of funny. Like the airline as they fill up the tank, right? Cut your
Exactly.
So I'm not sure where the lesson is here, but I was just thinking that because literally it was wall-to-wall people in the airport last night. Yeah. Everyone was stuck. It was a nightmare. But I just thought this storm...
The best line from last night was the poor guy who walked off the plane that we were waiting for, who had been sitting on the tarmac for over 2 hours. And he walked out and what did he say?
He said, "You could not pay me $1 million to get back on that plane." As we're sitting there waiting to get on that plane at midnight. And then I'm like, and then he walked off. I was like, no, wait, you can't say something like that and then just walk away. Were there mechanical troubles? Right. At that point, we didn't know. So it was really funny. But yeah, because there was a storm that went through that just dumped devastating hail and winds in the area we were flying through, and again, just another devastating storm.
But I think you're onto
now.
something. I mean, I think if they want shorter lines and want smoother travel, then let's
address climate change and let's all do our part and just change things around. Then we can all travel a little bit better.
All right, let's start the movement.
Are you in for it? Okay, so we spent time this week at a conference of pastors for children.
Yep.
You want to talk a little bit about that organization?
Yeah. Well, the last couple of weeks, we have been traveling a lot, as you just said, but we've been going to some incredible events and got to spend time at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, where I delivered the commencement address up there in Minnesota, which was fabulous. And then I was on assignment after that I can't talk about, but a really exciting project that Good Faith Media is involved in. And then we were in Orlando, Florida to attend the Pastors for Children event that brings clergy together from across the country to support public education. And I love this so much on so many levels because, one, I am a clergy, and two, I am a son and grandson of public educators. So I'm a big proponent of public education, and we've done a lot of work here in the state of Oklahoma to support teachers and public education all around.
Yes, this group is doing fantastic work, and they are really affecting change at the legislative level. They're stopping voucher bills and just doing a lot of really tangible work to support our public schools. Just on the ground fighting. But one note that I had, one of the speakers said, as they were talking, made a comment that said, we can't stop at speaking to power. We have to also speak about power. And I wrote that down. I thought that was a really powerful statement for me, is that, and he was speaking to pastors.
Right.
Basically, you have to be bold. You can speak to power, but you also have to be real in speaking about power and about the corruption and name it.
Yeah.
Name what's happening. And I know for a lot of pastors, that's really terrifying. And I identify with that as someone who was married to clergy, who's behind the pulpit, and I was worried about paying our bills. But, the point was, we have to speak about it, call out what's going on, call out the fallacies about vouchers and about school choice and about, what's going on legislatively in these areas. So I don't know. I just thought that might be something that our listeners could cling to as well, is that we can't just speak to power. We have to speak honestly about power.
Absolutely. And we heard a lot of pastors talking about that in Orlando this week. And you and I get to sit down with Jim Wallis, and he talks about power in our interview with him.
Yes, his book is fantastic. I highly recommend it. It was equal parts informative, but also encouraging, and also just a really great reassurance for me in the midst of Christian nationalism and how soured so many things about the Christian faith have become. Just a reminder of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and looking at what he did and how he lived out his life and ministry, and how we can implement that in our lives.
So coming up next, Missy and I sat down with Jim Wallis, his new book, The False White Gospel, Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy. Stay tuned.
Theological education should not be an echo chamber. That's why seminary students in the Baptist House of Studies at Perkins School of Theology experience an open-minded, warm, idealistic expression of what it means to be Baptist. The Baptist House of Studies supports each individual Baptist or Free Church student in the program. It doesn't matter if you join classes in Dallas or from elsewhere through the hybrid format. Learn more about the Baptist House of Studies at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. Go to smu.edu/Perkins. Click on Visit Campus to see upcoming webinars where you can learn more about all that the Baptist House and Perkins have to offer. That's smu.edu/Perkins.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Jim Wallis is a writer, teacher, preacher, and justice advocate who believes the gospel of Jesus must be emancipated from its cultural and political captivities. He is a New York Times bestselling author, public theologian, preacher, and commentator on ethics and public life. He founded Sojourners Magazine and is the author of 12 books, including America's Original Sin, God's Politics, The Great Awakening, and The Call to Conversion. His podcast, The Soul of the Nation, features conversations conversations with grassroots organizers and political leaders and discusses how to take action to promote racial and social justice, life and peace, and environmental stewardship. His latest book, The False White Gospel, Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy, is currently available. Jim Wallis, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Glad to be here with you, Mitch and Missy. A joy for me.
Yes, Jim, thank you for being here. I do feel like we're sort of in the presence of royalty right now. So forgive me if I'm a little just
I was
verklempt.
wondering why you curtsied just now, so now I get it.
So thank you for being with us. But I want to start out by just having you discuss a little bit about what you mean by false white gospel and what its origins are.
Right. Well, that's the big question right now. White Christian nationalism is the false white gospel. And the name spells the problem. You have the most inclusive, welcoming, inviting message in the world that becomes white. It says Christian, but they don't mean service and sacrifice and love. They mean control and dominance. And you two will know the history of dominion theology, dominionist theology. Mm-hmm. It's control. It's not service and sacrifice. And finally, nationalism. My goodness, Jesus, when he said goodbye to his followers, he says, "Go into all the world and make disciples in every nation, teaching them to observe everything I've taught to you." Nationalist, really? Mm-hmm. And so right. This Bible selling presidential candidate. God bless the USA on its Bible.
Yeah.
That's idolatry is false worship. That's really a big word, but that's what it means. So it's the false worship of a nation. And so the book is mostly about the problem of this, but more, what are some iconic biblical texts that can take us forward? I'll just say one of them here in relation to your question. This is Jesus said, "You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Every audience knows the last word in that phrase. And as I reworked that text, rethought all these texts, the opposite of the truth isn't lying, it's captivity. Captivity. Truth and freedom are indivisible. A whole lot of people who wouldn't even know the term white Christian nationalism are captive to its lies, are captive to it. So I think we have a big job to set the captives free, including our own white Christian folk.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jim, I want to unpack that phrase, white Christian nationalism, because is this false gospel that you're talking about, and I know you outline it in the book, but how related is the white gospel, or the false white gospel, how is it connected to America's racist past? And would you argue that this latest era of white Christian nationalism that has erupted across the nation over the last 10 years or so is in response to the first African-American president in our history?
Well, it's in response to, even before Obama, it's in response to America's original sin, which is the founding of this nation. The so-called doctrine of discovery was brought here with papal edicts and religious support to literally eradicate indigenous people here and steal their land, and then to kidnap Africans, a whole race, and make them into chattel property. Stolen land and free labor was what originally made America great.
Yeah.
It was powerful and successful. And all of that now is being threatened. The people who are trying to take us backwards and not let us go forward, I can summarize their strategy in a single sentence, which is they want to prevent our changing demography from changing our democracy. So voter suppression, gerrymandering, voter IDs to make it harder to vote, all of that is part of, they don't want the changing demographics, they really can't change. Even in places like Oklahoma, as you know better than I.
Right.
But they want to keep that from changing our democracy, which is white minority rule. My classes had charged us, and I said, how many of you in this class are white males like me who own property? And the white males in the class don't normally own a house. I own a house. So I said, so the Constitution, those documents were for me, just for me,
Right.
only for me, not for any of you. So the whole project is to imagine, and the founders, most of them didn't even imagine this, that this would be extended to all of us here in this room, very diverse classes. So that's what's happening in America, which is very exciting, actually. But the people in control want to keep that from happening. So race is at the core of this. That's why I always say white Christian nationalism. It's at the core of this. And Eddie Glaude, who wrote the wonderful foreword to the book, says, I love this quote, he says, everything is falling apart and everything is possible at the same time.
I love that.
And so I say in the book, I want to, every movement has to decide who you can persuade and who you must defeat. I mean, non-violently at the ballot box. But I hope there are tools here to help people learn how to persuade their friends and family and relationships, and then how they can take on. The president holds a Bible up. Let's take it on. Let's take on the Bible.
Right.
Let's have a discussion, even a debate. What does the Bible say? And when a man running for president puts up, I can't help but laughing at this, but puts up a pose with him at the defense table where he spends all his time these days, and a cartoon of Jesus next to him at the table, and then he says, I am being indicted for you. Now, we've never had a president compare himself to Jesus Christ quite like that. And so when a president does that, it's fair to raise the teachings of Jesus. So what did Jesus say? What did Jesus do? And are we going to attend to that or not? That's a very legitimate question. And we need a theology of democracy.
I have that in my notes from the book. I wrote that one down. That was amazing.
Did you, Jim, to pick up on that, because part of a lot of the book is about refounding democracy, but there's also a need to rethink our theology or recenter our theology. And, the late, great Phyllis Tickle talked about every 500 years going through that rummage sale that the church goes through. And, we're at that 500-year period right now. You mentioned the doctrine of Christian discovery that began with that papal bull in 1493. Do you think the church at this moment, at this time, is opening to recentering itself in a new way, a new theology that really changes the way we have thought for 500 years, especially here in the West, about a conversion-based theology? Or I'm an indigenous person. I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. What my ancestors experienced, an assimilation into the white Christian culture. Do you think we need to shift that to a different understanding, more based upon the Great Commandment than the Great Commission?
Well, let me put it this way. Many people feel the answer to bad religion. That's what white Christian nationalism is, bad religion. The answer to bad religion is no religion. Now, that's understandable, given what we're seeing all around us. My students often feel that way. But the answer to bad religion is actually the title of your podcast, Good Faith, Better Faith. What does true faith mean? And I think we are, Mitch, at a place where that's being rethought by a whole new generation. My students, the last chapter in the book is called A Remnant Church. This is where a new generation, a lot of younger people, younger white believers, but some older ones too, are ready to join with Black and brown, indigenous, Asian American church leaders to really create will be a new American church. There's a new thing possible. And if we can fight off this attack on our democracy and our faith, we're not going to just go back to democracy as it has been. It's got to be transformed. And I think a new American church could exemplify that wonderful diversity of what Peggy Flanagan, the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota, is an Indigenous woman, highest ranking Indigenous woman at the state level. She's part of my extended family. We vacation with them every year.
Oh, nice.
We spend a lot of time, and she's Catholic. She's a person of faith, which isn't often true for a lot of Democrats like herself.
Right.
She's arguing all the time for Democrats not so being afraid of religion and bring faith back, but she means this kind of faith. Her Catholic Church practices this kind of faith. Indigenous people, a whole lot of minority people, immigrants fill the church. And every Sunday, her church is a place where this is happening. And so I really think that a lot is possible now. We have a battle to fight here. This is a moment, a milestone. It's, to use language that you know, it's not Chronos time, tick-tock, tick-tock.
Right.
It's Kairos time, time that changes time, events that change events for generations to come. We are in a Kairos time. But if we respond in a biblical way to that, and I love your language of the commandments, Jesus says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do anything that I say? It's like, I love that text.
Right.
And it's like, well, good question, Lord. So how do we do that? How do we get back to practicing what Jesus taught? And I think this moment of crisis could be a time where we hopefully win some political battles, but more importantly, we go deeper. So it isn't don't go left, don't go right, go deeper. What does it mean to go deeper, particularly into the teachings of Jesus, which is why I spent so much time on these iconic texts in the.
So since you brought up Jesus, let's go
That
there
guy.
for a minute. That guy. So one thing, Mitch and I spend a lot of time in this space of Christian nationalism. We've read countless books and interviewed authors, and it's so difficult to figure out where to land in your faith journey when you're so frustrated with all of those, institutions that claim your faith. And I think one thing I really appreciated about your book is that you, in a way that hasn't happened before for me, said, yes, this is an evil thing. This is not good. We need to combat it. But here's why I am still standing firm as a follower of Jesus. These are his words. This is what he instructed. And so I want to take a moment of personal privilege, just ask you to comment on a few things that really stood out to me from the book. And you kind of alluded to a minute ago, but you said we've got to stop asking what would Jesus do and start looking at what did Jesus do. And the reframing of that for me was really, and I don't know, just it jumped off the page at me in that moment, because when we talk about, if we want to say what would Jesus do, that allows us the chance to put in our own ethic, our own filter, our own, what would Jesus do if he were in my shoes right now? Instead of what did Jesus do and how does that translate into my life? So I would love to have you talk about that a little bit. And then also the clarification and delineation between peacekeepers and peacemakers.
Yeah, sure. Well, Missy, your story, this is all about our stories. It's not easy. It's a struggle. I'm speaking in Detroit tonight. I'm in Michigan, a critical state for us all right now. And I was in Lansing last night. I was in Grand Rapids 2 weeks ago. I'm in Detroit tonight, where I was born and raised. And this came up early in my life. I was converted in Detroit. A revival preacher came one Sunday night, and all the unsaved kids had to sit in the front row, because the closer you are to a sermon, the more it'll impact your life. He pointed right at me and he said, it felt like right at me, if Jesus came back tonight, your mommy and daddy would be taken to heaven and you would be left all by yourself.
I remember hearing that same thing, yes.
Got my attention. I was getting up in years. I was 6. I would have had a 5-year-old sister to support if that would have happened.
I mean, and
But
at
my
6, you needed to be converted from your evil ways, right? Yes.
the sin of those first 6 years was unbelievable. But then my second conversion, though, really was leading right into your question. It was when I'm a teenager now. I'm listening to my city. I'm paying attention. I'm reading the papers. I'm hearing the news. And something really big seemed really wrong in my country, my church, my city. And I started asking questions about it. Why is life so different in Black Detroit from what I can understand in white Detroit? I wasn't getting any honest answers until that one said, well, if you keep asking these questions, son, you're going to get in trouble. That proved to be true. I went into the city of Detroit, and I just showed up at Black churches. Just showed up. And they took the naive white boy questions and patiently answered them. I took jobs alongside young men who were young Black men. I was a young white man. I'm making money to go to college, and they're supporting their families. And their life experiences were so different than mine. Their life stories ultimately changed my life story. And I saw what Frederick Douglass called these two Christianities in this country. And they're really side by side. What he calls the auction block and the church bell were connected. And so in Detroit, when I found the Black churches, it was I never heard about Black churches. We never talked about Black churches. We never invited them. We never got invited. So I found this trail, and that's what has really shaped my whole life. I tell my students that my worldview has always been changed most by being places I was never supposed to be, and with people I was never supposed to meet or know or talk to or become friends with. That's how proximity changes us. And so for me, when I was told by an elder in my church who knew I was going into the city all the time and hanging out at Black churches, he said, son, you have to realize that Christianity, elder in my Plymouth Brethren church, has nothing to do with racism. That's political, and faith is personal. I left that night in my head, in my heart, and I was at Michigan State last night, where I went to school, and I was totally secular as an activist. I left my Christian faith behind. I wanted nothing to do with any of the Christian groups on campus. They're on the wrong side of everything we were fighting for, Vietnam and war and peace and racism and poverty. So, but after shutting down the university back in 1970, I wanted to go deeper. I knew I wanted to be an activist or try to help social change, but I didn't have an adequate foundation for it. And finally, Ho Chi Minh, Che Guevara, and Karl Marx weren't satisfied. And so I could never quite get shed of Jesus.
Right.
And so I went back just to read Jesus again. And I read things I had never heard about in church. And the Matthew 25 text was my conversion text. I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was naked. I was sick. I was a stranger. That means immigrant. I was in prison, and you weren't there for me. Lord, when do we see you hungry and thirsty? As you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. That was more radical than anything I'd ever read before. Right. And I signed up. So I never quite lost Jesus. And I went back to Jesus. And that's what then became Sojourners and all the rest. So my experience is we can come back, we can come home, we can find our way back, but we're dealing with two trajectories of the church.
Yeah. One
is from the doctrine of discovery and slavery with a racial hierarchy, a white racial hierarchy. So indigenous people and enslaved Black people of color are used and abused, are not even seen as human beings. That's way back at the beginning, and that's still, we're battling. And so on the peacemaker piece, we're in the most polarized time I can remember. And so I said last night, so Jesus said, blessed are the peace lovers. Is that right? No.
Nope.
Oh, okay. Maybe it was peacekeepers, keep the lid on.
Right.
no, what did he say? And they said, peacemakers. I said, yeah, which means conflict resolvers, right? White Christian nationalists are conflict creators.
Yeah.
They're making divisions. They're dividing us by intent. And what does it mean that Jesus tells us, his disciples, in the Beatitudes? Blessed are the peacemakers, for they we call the children of God. So all these texts are so relevant, and I'm not afraid of the left like a lot of people are. I'm from the left. I was from that world, and I chose Jesus over that world. And I still relate to all kinds of people on both sides of the aisle. But it's got to be a Jesus conversation. And you said it well. What did Jesus say, and what did he do? And how do we relate that to where we are right now?
And you mentioned in your talking just now about proximity, and I have notes about that after reading the book. And in two of the things you tied together is that we need vulnerability with proximity in order to affect change. So speak to that a little bit. And also, would you mind going over a little bit, starting with, because for someone like me who wasn't alive during the civil rights era, some things I think historically are so important to talk about and to remember. For a lot of our audience, they may know this, but start from the swimming pools, the city swimming pools, and build on that as to how we've kind of gotten here today. I thought that was a really great jumping off point in the book.
That's from Heather McGee's wonderful book, Some of Us, one of the best books on race, recent books that we have, and how when at the civil rights movement, when in fact it was no longer legal to keep Southern blacks out of the big community swimming pools down south. As you know, it's hot. And so the pool was like mansions and beautiful places where people came and they just cooled off and they bonded, related to each other. And when they could no longer keep young black kids out of those pools, they shut down the pools. They cemented them over. And nobody got to swim in pools anymore, except those who had their own pools or were members of rich country clubs where they had pools. So everybody lost. And to me, Heather has a powerful metaphor here for draining pools. We drain ourselves of things that could benefit all of us, but we're afraid of those were decisions we've made. Like I'm back to Detroit here. I'm going to be in Detroit tonight. My dad came back from World War II. He was a mechanical engineer on a destroyer, chief mechanical officer. He came back and he got, GIs like my dad, a GI Bill for any education they needed, and FHA loan for the house, my first family house. Housing and education make you middle class. My government made our family middle class. No black sailors on his ship got that. No black GIs got that. It was a racialized geography decision that created my white school, my white neighborhood, and my white church. Deliberate decisions made to avoid proximity, because proximity is what changes us. I was a janitor at Detroit Edison, and my new friend Butch wanted to take me home for dinner one night to meet his mom and his siblings. His father had passed. And we talking about the police, and she says, "Yeah, that's why I tell my kids, if you're ever lost and can't find your way home, and you see a policeman, duck under a stairwell, hide behind a building, wait till he passes, and then find your way home." My mother's words screamed in my head at that moment to her 5 kids. If you're lost, can't find your way home, look for a policeman. The policeman is your friend, and he'll bring you home safely. 2 women, neither of them were militant, political, 2 worlds, depending on whether the kids are black and white. They live in, so that was what we call an epiphany for me, a realization. And proximity creates epiphanies. You learn things, you see things, you know things. I tell my students, trust your questions and follow them to take you wherever they will lead you to try to find the answer. So we're supposed to be this body of Christ. Globally, we're the most diverse human community on the planet. today. We
Yeah.
are, but we're not here, right?
Right.
So back to King, he did say famously, 11 o'clock is the most segregated hour in American week. That's still painfully true. And he also said to white Christian nationalism, he wanted to remind the churches that we are not the master of the state, nor the servant of the state. We are the conscience of the state.
Yeah. So, Jim, to kind of pick up on that idea, there's a lot of things that we have talked about on this podcast. We've written about at Good Faith Media. A lot of things to be critical about when it comes to white Christian nationalism, racial injustices, income inequality, climate change, all of that. But there's also some things to be hopeful for. And you talk about that in the book, about this emerging generation that is taking justice to the streets. And ever since 2020, I have been inspired by that generation. Every time I went out to a march and we covered it, it was like going to church for me with the singing and the sermons and the community. It was really remarkable. So a lot of good things happening, and we're continuing to see that even today. But there is a disconnect between this emerging generation of social justice advocates and the institutional church. And you talk about that in the book, about how the civil rights advocates, were centered in the local church. But this emerging generation has that same passion, calling for, similar justice in these areas that they're talking about and advocating for. But there is a disconnect. Can you speak to that? And do you see, is there a way to bridge that gap?
I met Brittany Packnett on the streets of Ferguson in all the demonstrations there. And Brittany was the head of Teach for America in St. Louis. And instead of hearing about the stories from last night from the kids in her class, she went to the streets. And she's actually from a Black church, strong history there. But like many millennials, she had drifted away. And she told me how she found God again, her faith again, in the streets with rubber bullets and tear gas and not knowing whether she would survive the night. And so about 3 months after I met her and the other leaders of Black Lives Matter in Ferguson, we had a retreat for faith leaders. And in Ferguson, I was able to get the young leaders together with these faith leaders. And it was a powerful evening. And they said, we're not the not young kids, young people, young leaders. They said, we're not against the church. In fact, some of us have backgrounds, and we all have grandmothers who were there. You can reach people we can't, but we can reach people in the streets that you can't. And Otis Moss III, who's wonderful.
Love him.
And reference him in the book. He said, well, I preach prophetically. I mean, my father was in King's Inner Circle in the South. Otis Moss Jr. I went to Morehouse. I'm at Trinity Church, Chicago, Jeremiah Wright's old church. But tonight you changed my life, as I realized I've been preaching from a place of common comfort. And so Black Lives Matter Chicago is called the Black Youth Project. And when I went to preach at his church a year later, he had gone to the streets, gone out of the sanctuary in the streets. And he had Black Youth Project leaders in his office for a discussion after the sermon that day. And so it means going out from the churches into the streets. And we were talking last night about the gun violence issue in Michigan. So I want to see young people walk past churches and say, I'm not sure I believe everything they believe in there. I'm not even sure what they all believe in there. But that's where we have our town meetings about gun violence. That's where we solve problems that we're trying to deal with as a community.
Yes.
And that's what will build the bridge, when we take our faith to the streets and to the issues and places where young people who are not apathetic, they are engaged. They don't often feel us engaged with them in the things they care most about. We can change that, and we are changing that all over the country.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. Well, Jim Wallis, thanks for being a guest this week on Good Faith Weekly. Jim's brand new book is The False White Gospel, Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy. It is something you're going to want to pick up and not want to put down because it is that good. Jim, we always enjoy reading you and now talking to you. Look forward to seeing you this summer at the Wild Goose Festival in North Carolina. But before we let you go, Jim, Missy's got one last question she asked all of our guests.
So, Jim, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of the work that you do, our conversation today, or anything else you want to leave the audience with, what is your more to tell?
That's a good way to end. I said to the folks last night in Lansing, and I'll say tonight, I don't want to hear, well, finally, a good conversation about faith and politics. I don't want your listeners to say, oh, finally, have you heard this podcast? This is really, you're going to like this. I like this. I felt so lonely and isolated, but this is what I believe, and this is great. That's not enough. The more to tell is from your people and the audiences last night to tell these stories, this story we discussed today, to all their relationships. In Grand Rapids, we had 500 people show up in West Virginia.
Wow.
I would guess that most of them were leaning in the direction of this book.
Mm-hmm.
But you all know people who aren't,
Mm-hmm.
who are captive, who are stuck, who are, your families, your congregations. It's all going on. And Brittany Packnett would say, if you want to join me in the streets with the rubber bullets and the tear gas and the threats, that's fine. You can go, and if you survive, say, I was there. But more important for you, the risk you've got to take is talking to your family and friends, your congregations. Thomas Merton once said, everything is about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. We've got to there's more to say, taking this conversation into our congregations, into our circles. All of us are influencers. Everyone listening is an influencer in some places and spaces. The conversation's got to go out into the streets and into our churches and congregations. And we've got to change the faith factor in this election campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Not be about the trajectory of fear, hatred, and violence, which is the current trajectory, to what it means to love our neighbors as ourselves.
Mm.
The Samaritan was othered by the Judeans. There were no good Samaritans as far as they were concerned. But here's a Jew lying by the side of the road, beaten and robbed, and here's a Samaritan who's othered by the whole community. And he sees an other lying on the side of the road, and Jesus uses him as the example of what it means to be a neighbor.
Mm.
Someone who's othered, reaching out to someone who's other to him. And the lawyer's question of Jesus, by the way, that's a Washington lawyer in that text, because I know that tone of voice. He'd say, who is my neighbor? He said, oh, exactly, who is my neighbor? How can I get out of obligation? And Jesus used the example of the Samaritan. So the Good Samaritan, for example, can take us into multiracial democracy. So let's take the Good Samaritan, take these conversations into our churches, and let's talk about what faith means, what, as you said, Missy, so well, what Jesus said and what he did. Mm-hmm. And what does that mean for me right now? That's taking the story further.
Love it. Jim Wallis, thank you so much. It's always a joy. And again, the book is The False White Gospel, Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy. Jim, always a pleasure to see you.
My blessing. I'll be in your neighborhood in the fall, so we'll hang out.
Absolutely.
Exciting.
I have to admit, I was really excited about this interview. Jim is an icon within progressive Christianity.
He is. I know you have long admired him and his work at Sojourners and his books, and I know you were very excited to get to speak to him one-on-one. So yeah, you have a glow about you.
I have a glow about me.
You're
yes,
fangirling a little bit. Is that okay to say? I don't know. Maybe not. So I really appreciated it. And I was taking notes even as he was talking because I think he just has so many great things to say. In one we can maybe talk about a little bit, but it made me laugh. He says, my worldview was changed the most when I was in places I wasn't supposed to be and hanging out with folks I wasn't supposed to be talking to or something to that effect. And I thought, same, except in a different context when I was a teenager, probably.
Tell us more, Missy.
Yeah, no. But I thought, wow, that's so true. That is the very nature of emulating Jesus and being a Jesus follower. Where was Jesus? He was always in the places where he wasn't, societally, that weren't acceptable to be, or people that were acceptable to hang around. And so I thought Jim is such a great communicator of what it means to be a Jesus follower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing that, he has inspired me personally as well as professionally for decades now, following his work at Sojourners, as you said, and reading, his 12 books now, 13 books, I think. But the one thing I've really appreciated about him is his ability to look at what's going on in culture and what's going on in society and offer not only a prophetic voice, but also a pastoral voice. And he does it with gentleness and kindness and humility, but he stands true to his beliefs and his convictions. And I think that's really important, especially in today's divisive and partisan culture that we live in, to maintain those convictions, but do it with civility, do it with passion and kindness, but never back down for what you believe, and following your passion and your heart.
Yeah, he's done such a great job of as we mentioned in the opening, speaking to power, speaking about power. He has a statement in the book that, says he says, I believe in separation of church and state, but the separation of church and state does not require the segregation of moral and religious values from public life. And, those are crucial to challenge political and economic power and shape movements for social change. And I thought that was a great framing, especially in the world we live in, again, where we are out of the Baptist tradition, which champions separation of church and state, and kind of navigating what that means within public life. And I thought that was a great descriptor of what it means to enact your faith in the public square.
Yeah. Growing up Baptist, it was always emphasized in my tradition that there was this wall of separation between church and state that Thomas Jefferson famously used in his letter to the Danbury Baptists when he was president. He built off the hedge that separated the wilderness of the world from the garden of the church that Roger Williams wrote about when he was around in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But we talk about that evolution of the wall, and then Justice Hugo Black picks that up in the 20th century, and he adds to it, calling it high and impregnable. But the reality is, when Jefferson uses that metaphor, I think about his property in Monticello. Lots of problems about that, but you look at the walls that he's talking about, and they're about 3 foot high if you go to Monticello, and they're walls in which delineate separation, but also provide opportunities for conversation. And as Jim said, quoting MLK, that the church should never be servants or slaves of the state, but we're the conscience of the state. We stand at that wall, respecting the separation of church and state, but we can voice and be the conscience of the state at the same time.
And I think that really, and again, getting out of our little bubble in our ecosystem, it's not just the Christian faith that can be
100%.
more.
I want to stand there beside my, Jewish and Muslim brothers as well.
Right, because for most faith traditions, you have an ethic of helping others and caring for the environment, and these are tenets of many faith traditions. And so, it is for all of us to stand and be that kind of a moral compass for government. Because my thought is, if left alone, what are people in power always going to become if there's no moral compass? You're going to become morally averse.
I've talked about that. In fact, we had a conversation about this with some pastors down in Orlando about the breadth of relationships that we have because of this work, and how sometimes I jokingly refer to my good friend Imad Chauncey, the imam here in Oklahoma City, as the best Christian I know, which I still think is, pretty true just because of his convictions. But then, I've run into, Buddhists, I've run into Jewish people, I've run into atheists. All of them, exhibit incredible what we would define as Christian characteristics or Christian morals and values. They would not characterize them as Christian, but as their conscience or their ethical code. And I think Christians need to finally realize that we do not have a monopoly on values and ethical codes and, good decision making. People of all faiths and all stripes.
First, from my context, we got to get out of the camp of Baptists have the monopoly on, all things moral and good and basically access to the pearly gates.
Now you're just causing trouble.
We got to go a few steps back on that, Mitch. That inner fundamentalist is in my head right now.
Yeah. Well, let's just go ahead and push that inner fundamentalist back where she came from.
So I want to wrap up today. I really wanted to talk to Jim about this part of the book, but didn't get to. He tells a story about a woman he worked with in D.C. Feeding hungry, folks who are food insecure, named Mary Glovers. And she had a prayer, and he talked about just her ability to pray and connect in such a powerful way. But she would start every Saturday before they would hand food out. She would pray over all the volunteers. And something that she said, she kind of opens up with, I'm thankful today that the walls of my room are not my coffin and that my bed is not my cooling board. And just basically talking about just the gift of life and being thankful to be alive. But then she goes into and says, Lord, we know you'll be coming through this line today. Help us treat you well.
Wow.
And that just spoke to me because we talk about, Jesus' passage, as you do so unto the least of these, you do so unto me. Mm-hmm. But I just thought that is such a more powerful way of saying that. We know you'll be coming. I know, Jesus, I will cross your path today, wherever that is. Help me be good to you. Mm-hmm. Wow. What if you start your day like that?
It would be amazing. Did you start your day as you walked into this office at 2?
No. You know what? I'm talking to everybody else out there.
Okay.
Just let's be clear about that.
Okay, I got you. But that is a beautiful sentiment, and she's absolutely right.
It's such a beautiful reframing, something I needed to hear, something I need to hear every day. Lord, I will be crossing your path today. Help me treat you well.
Just wonderful, very inspirational, and I believe it.
I'll work at it.
We'll start tomorrow.
Right. After I've had some sleep.
All right. Well, it's been a great week, Missy. I don't know about you, but I could use some rest.
I think a nap is in order.
I agree.
A little bit of an extended lunch hour nap, maybe.
I agree. Well, until next week, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.